I spent $25,000 on a luxury family cruise across the Mediterranean, dreaming of golden sunsets and memories with my loved ones. But at the bustling port, my daughter looked me in the eye and said there was no cabin for me and that I should go home. In that moment, I realized I had been erased from the very beginning. What followed was a shocking chain of betrayal, desperate phone calls, and a plan for justice that would change everything. By the end, the people who thought they could discard me would learn that actions have consequences. Before we begin, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you would love to travel one day. Now, let me take you back to the day it all started when I first realized something was terribly wrong. For months, I had been planning the trip in my mind, the kind of journey that would heal old wounds and stitch our family together again. My late wife, Eleanor, had always dreamed of sailing through the Mediterranean. She loved history, art, and culture, and she often said that one day she wanted to see the whitewashed houses of Santorini and the grand cathedrals of Italy. After she passed away, the dream remained unfinished, floating in my mind like an unkept promise. So when I decided to spend my savings on a family cruise, it was not just a vacation. It was a tribute to her memory, a chance to bring everyone together in the kind of setting she would have adored. My daughter Clara had seemed delighted when I told her the plan. She clasped her hands together and said it was the most generous thing anyone had ever done for the family. Her husband Daniel nodded approvingly while their children bounced in their seats at the thought of swimming pools, games, and adventures at sea. Even my younger brother Harold agreed to join us, though he usually kept his life very separate from mine. It felt as though for once the Harrington family would share something unforgettable. I had envisioned it clearly. Clara and I would stand on deck in the evenings, watching the sun sink into the horizon while Daniel told stories to the children. Harold would likely wander the library of the ship or spend his evenings with a glass of wine, but even that would be part of the charm. It would be a gathering of lives that had long drifted apart. I told myself that this cruise could be a new beginning, a chance to feel less alone, and to remind my family that I was not just an old man, but a father, a brother, a grandfather. The morning of departure was filled with excitement. The port city was alive with energy tourists dragging suitcases across cobblestone streets, music spilling out of open cafes, and the distant hum of ships preparing to sail. The cruise ship itself rose above the harbor like a gleaming palace, its polished decks reflecting the morning sunday. Flags fluttered from the masts, and the sound of announcements carried across the water, promising adventure and luxury. My heart lifted at the sight, and for a brief moment I believed everything was going to be as perfect as I had imagined. We arrived at the terminal together, Clara walking just ahead with Daniel and the children. Harold trailed behind, muttering about the length of the line and the weight of his luggage. I wheeled my suitcase beside me, smiling at the families around us. I thought about how Eleanor would have loved this scene, the chaos of travel, the voices of anticipation, the sense that life was about to change. As we reached the check-in counters, I turned to Clara with a question on my lips about where we might dine first once we were aboard. But her face had changed. The brightness in her eyes dimmed and her voice came low and hesitant. "Father," she said, barely meeting my gaze, "there isn't a cabin for you. You should return home." At first I thought I had misheard her. Perhaps she meant there was a mistake with the room or that she was nervous about something else. I asked her to repeat herself, certain that confusion was twisting her words. But Clara's expression hardened, and Daniel shifted uncomfortably beside her. "There is no cabin," she repeated firmer this time. "You cannot board with us. You will have to go back." The air seemed to leave my lungs. Around me the terminal carried on with its noise and color, but inside my chest there was only silence. My mind scrambled to make sense of it. I had given her the money. I had trusted her to arrange everything. For weeks we had spoken of excursions, of meals, of family nights on deck. How could it be possible that there was no cabin for me? I refused to believe it. My feet carried me forward to the nearest check-in counter, where a woman in a crisp uniform greeted me with professional cheer. I gave her my name, asked her to search again, certain that Clara was mistaken. She typed quickly, scanned her screen, then looked up with a polite frown. I am sorry, sir. There is no reservation under your name. The booking I see is for 6 guests, but it does not include you. Her words struck like a hammer. I asked her to check again to widen the search to look under any possible variation of my name. But the result was always the same. 6 tickets had been purchased. My family was aboard that list. I was not. Behind me, Clara shifted her weight, avoiding my eyes. Daniel placed a hand on her shoulder, steering the children toward the boarding gates. They did not argue. They did not apologize. They simply acted as though this was the way it had always been meant to be. And in their faces I saw not panic, not guilt, but relief. Relief that I was not going with them. The crowd pressed around me, families handing over passports and luggage, excited voices rising in anticipation of the voyage ahead. My own suitcase felt suddenly heavy in my hand, a useless burden. I turned back to Clara, hoping for some explanation, some sign that she regretted what she was doing. But she would not meet my gaze. She adjusted her son's backpack and followed Daniel toward the ship. It was in that moment that I understood. This had not been a mistake. This had not been an oversight. This had been decided long before I ever reached the port. I had been written out of the story from the very beginning. The ship's horn sounded a long, mournful call that echoed across the water. Passengers cheered, waving from the deck as the crew prepared for departure. Fireworks cracked above the harbor, showering the sky with color. It was a scene of celebration, a promise of adventure. But I stood alone on the pier, watching the vessel prepare to sail without me. The irony cut deep. I had imagined myself surrounded by family basking in their gratitude and affection. Instead, I was a figure left behind, discarded like an afterthought. My chest ached, not just from the betrayal, but from the realization of how carefully it had all been hidden from me. Every conversation, every smile, every false promise had been designed to keep me blind until the last possible moment. As the gangway lifted and the ship pulled slowly from the dock, I felt something shift inside me. A part of me wanted to collapse under the weight of it, to return home quietly and accept that I was no longer wanted. But another part of me, stronger and sharper, refused to let the story end there. I tightened my grip on my suitcase handle and turned away from the water. The noise of the port faded behind me. As I walked into the city streets, my mind racing. I did not yet know what I would do, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. If Clara and Daniel believed they had erased me so easily, they were about to learn how wrong they were. And that was only the beginning. What I discovered next at the cruise desk would shatter any lingering illusions I had about mistakes or misunderstandings. It would prove without a doubt that my family's betrayal was deliberate, calculated, and far more cruel than I had imagined. The cruise ship's horn still echoed faintly in the distance as I stood on the crowded pier trying to steady my breath. I told myself there had to be an explanation, some rational reason why my name had not been on that list. Perhaps Clara had made a last-minute mistake, or Daniel had failed to forward the final confirmation. It was easier to believe in error than in betrayal. But something gnawed at me, a memory of her eyes when she told me to go home. There had been no panic in them, only resolve. I wheeled my suitcase back toward the terminal, the sound of its wheels scraping against the stones, louder than the chatter of tourists and the shouts of dock workers. My mind was in turmoil, but one thought cut through with clarity. If this was truly a mistake, the records at the cruise desk would prove it. If not, then I would see in black and white the truth that I already feared. The check-in hall was still alive with movement, though the crowd was thinning now that most passengers had boarded. Behind the counters, attendants worked briskly, printing tickets, handling luggage tags, and answering the endless stream of questions that came with any large voyage. I chose a different desk than before, not wanting to face the same polite woman who had already told me once that I did not exist in their system. The man at this desk had dark hair combed neatly back and glasses perched on his nose. He looked up as I approached and offered the kind of professional smile that was meant to calm impatient travelers. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I assist you?" I gave him Clara's name, explaining that she had made the booking for the family. His fingers flew across the keyboard as he searched. "Yes, I see the reservation here," he said after a moment. 6 passengers. Departure confirmed, cabins assigned. 6 passengers, I repeated. "Please can you tell me the names on that reservation?" He hesitated. "Normally, sir, I am not permitted to share the details due to privacy regulations." "This is my family." I pressed my voice tighter than I intended. "I paid for this entire trip. I need to know." Perhaps it was the desperation in my eyes or the way my hand shook as it rested on the counter, but he relented. He adjusted his glasses and read from the screen. Clara Whitfield, Daniel Whitfield, Harold Harrington, and 3 minors. He listed the names of my grandchildren, each one like a nail driven into my chest. Then he stopped. "That is all." My heart sank. "There is no Victor Harrington." "No, sir." "I am sorry. There is not." I gripped the edge of the counter as the truth solidified like stone. This had never been a mistake. Clara had planned this from the beginning. She had taken my money, smiled at my excitement, and then carved me out of the story as neatly as a surgeon removing an unwanted organ. The man looked uncomfortable under the weight of my silence. "If you wish, I can check the system history to see when the reservation was created." "Yes," I said immediately. "Please do." He tapped more keys, scrolling through records. After a pause, he nodded. "It appears the booking was finalized 8 weeks ago." 8 weeks. Long before Clara had sat at my kitchen table pretending to ask which excursions I would most enjoy. Long before she had listened patiently as I described how Eleanor always wanted to see Venice. Long before she had smiled and told me not to worry about details, that she would handle everything. The man at the counter cleared his throat gently. "Would you like me to see if there are any cabins available on this voyage?" "Yes," I said quickly, though I already suspected the answer. He searched his brow, furrowing deeper with each keystroke. Finally, he shook his head. "I am afraid this ship is fully booked. Every cabin is sold out. There are no openings." My last hope vanished. I asked about other ships, other cruises leaving within the week, anything that could bring me to the same destinations. Again, the answer was no. A convention in Italy, a summer rush in Greece, waiting lists dozens of names long. I stood there feeling as though the walls of the terminal were closing in. Clara had not just excluded me, she had trapped me. There was no way to follow, no way to appear at the ports she would visit, no way to insert myself back into the dream I had created. The man at the counter gave me a sympathetic look. "Sir, I am truly sorry. Is there anything else I can do for you?" I wanted to laugh at the question, though the sound that came from my throat was closer to a growl. What could he do? What could anyone do when the wound had been inflicted, not by strangers, but by my own blood? I thanked him stiffly and turned away, my suitcase rattling behind me as I walked back toward the exit. The terminal seemed suddenly colder, the lights harsher, the voices around me crueler in their cheer. Every family I passed looked like mockery, their smiles reminding me of what I had lost. Outside, the afternoon sun was sinking toward the water. The ship had already pulled further into the harbor, its white hull gleaming as it prepared to disappear beyond the horizon. On deck, my family would be exploring their cabins, ordering drinks, laughing about the adventure ahead. Perhaps Clara would even be congratulating herself on her cleverness, certain that I was at home by now, too weary or too humiliated to fight back. But she was wrong. As I stood there watching the ship drift into the distance, a different feeling rose within me. The grief was still there, sharp and raw, but beneath it something darker stirred. Anger. Resolve. The realization that if they had calculated to erase me, I could calculate in return. I walked slowly toward the taxi stand, each step steady, deliberate. Passengers hurried past me, dragging luggage, waving goodbye to relatives, eager for journeys that awaited them. But I moved with a different purpose. I was no longer chasing a vacation. I was pursuing truth. In the taxi, the driver asked where I was going. My voice came out calm, even though my hands trembled slightly in my lap. "Home," I said. "Montclair district." The ride was long, and the city blurred past the windows in streaks of gray and gold. I stared out at the familiar streets, but my mind was far from them. I replayed every conversation with Clara over the past months, hearing the false sweetness in her voice, the way she had steered me away from details, the careful way she had made sure I never saw the booking documents. I remembered Daniel's smug smile when I handed over the money as though he already knew the game was won. And I remembered Eleanor. Her voice came back to me firm and steady, reminding me of her favorite saying: "Kindness should never be mistaken for weakness." By the time the taxi pulled into my driveway, my course was set. I carried my suitcase inside, but I did not unpack. Instead, I went straight to my study and pulled out the folder where I kept all the receipts, all the transfers, all the evidence of the trip I had funded. I spread them across the desk, each page a testament to the trust I had given, each one now a weapon against the betrayal I had suffered. As I looked down at those papers, one detail struck me like lightning. The hotel booking that had been arranged for the cruise included a list of names, 6 names exactly as the cruise reservation had shown. Clara, Daniel, Harold, the children, but not me. Instead, the 6th name was Eleanor. Eleanor, my wife, who had been dead for 3 years. My blood turned cold. This was no accident. This was proof. Clara had deliberately used her mother's name to fill the space that should have been mine, never expecting that anyone would notice. It was a cruel mockery, a theft not only of my money but of my memories. I stared at the page until my vision blurred, my heart hammering in my chest. I thought of Eleanor's gentle smile, her endless patience, the love she had poured into our family. To see her name twisted into a lie was almost more than I could bear. But as I sat there, fury hardening into resolve, I realized that this was the moment of clarity I needed. They had erased me. They had mocked Eleanor's memory. They had treated my generosity as weakness. And for that they would pay. I reached for the phone, my fingers steady now. It was time to begin my response. And the first call I made would set into motion a plan that Clara and Daniel could never have imagined. What I discovered in the hours that followed would confirm every suspicion I had and ignite a chain of events that none of them were prepared for. Their dream vacation was only beginning, but so was my quiet, calculated retaliation. I sat at my desk, surrounded by receipts and confirmations, feeling a strange calm settle over the turmoil. The evidence lay before me like a map, and for the first time since the port, each line of print had a purpose beyond hurt. They had tried to erase me, and in doing so they had left a trail. I would follow it. I would make sure whatever I did next was precise and irrevocable. First, I called the cruise company back to confirm every detail once more. The agent read the timestamps and booking references exactly as I had seen them earlier. The reservation had been completed 8 weeks earlier, and the hotel booking matched the same 6 names. The agent asked if I wanted to add my name to a waiting list. I said no. I was not interested in a delayed admission to a vacation that had been designed to exclude me. I wanted consequences that mattered. Next, I made a different kind of call. I dialed the number of a solicitor I had used years ago when Eleanor was alive. Her name was Margaret Langford. She had a reputation for setting wrongs right, and she had never been gentle when gentleness would do harm. I explained calmly and without embellishment everything that had happened. I sent scanned copies of each transfer, each invoice, each text message that showed enthusiasm one moment and silence the next. Margaret listened and then asked a single question. Was I certain I wanted to pursue this legally? My hand rested on the edge of the desk as I considered her voice. I thought of Eleanor and her disdain for people who used kindness as a cloak for selfishness. I thought of the children laughing on the ship that had left me behind. I replied yes. I was certain. Her advice was immediate and practical. We would begin with estate planning. We would draft a new will that reflected my wishes now that I knew the truth. We would document my competency for any future challenge. We would include clear language about why certain family members would not benefit from my estate. She emphasized the importance of recorded statements and witnesses, and she suggested a video of the signing. If anyone attempted to claim coercion or manipulation later, the record would speak louder than any accusation. Margaret also pointed out another path. There were legal avenues for dealing with long-term financial exploitation. If I could show a pattern of transfers that had been manipulated or misrepresented, I could take measures that did not rely solely on testamentary change. We could seek injunctions if necessary. She promised to review all documents and prepare a strategy. I felt a small thrill at the thought of turning my tarnished generosity into a shield that would protect what I had left. That afternoon I went through the filing cabinets in a different way than I had before. What once felt like a testament to a life of giving now read like a ledger of exploitation. There were instances where I had covered mortgage payments because a son was short. There were tuition transfers and emergency medical payments that had never been repaid. There were gifts disguised as loans. Each entry was a line in a pattern that showed dependency and entitlement rather than mutual support. I made a list and I typed it into an email to Margaret. I attached copies of bank statements and flagged the most important transfers. I wrote a short note explaining the context of each payment. I kept the tone factual and spare. I knew that emotion would not help in the legal work that followed. Evidence would. That evening I sat in Eleanor's favorite chair and thought about what I had planned. I imagined signing a new will handing power to trustees and charities who would use the assets for public good. I pictured scholarships named for Eleanor rather than family members who had shown their true colors. The idea warmed me like a small sunrise. It was a future that felt right. Over the next 2 days, Margaret and I worked quickly. She called me with questions and suggestions. She recommended not only a will, but also the establishment of trusts that would be difficult to challenge. She explained the steps for removing certain family members as beneficiaries, and for appointing an independent executor who would be legally bound to carry out my expressed wishes. Margaret also had the wisdom to advise patience and the importance of timing. We scheduled an appointment for the initial drafting, and she asked me to gather proof of my mental fitness. I arranged for my primary care physician to conduct a basic exam and to provide a written statement. I asked a trusted friend to be available to testify to my clarity of mind. I requested a short neuropsychological assessment to be safe. These measures felt prudent rather than paranoid. I wanted the new documents to be unassailable. While the legal work proceeded, I made smaller moves that were part practical and part symbolic. I canceled the hotel reservation associated with the cruise. When I spoke to the reservations clerk, I did so without drama. I requested cancellation and accepted the penalty fees. The clerk informed me that the reservation had been active and that the cancellation would cause significant inconvenience for those arriving. I said that was the point. If they had arranged for me to be left behind, then they would see what it felt like to arrive with no room at the inn. After the cancellation, I received a flurry of messages that I did not answer. I wanted them to feel the confusion and panic without me fueling it. I knew this choice would cause immediate suffering for those who had been complicit, and I accepted that. It was not cruelty, I told myself, but a lesson. They had crafted their own consequences. Late one night, my phone buzzed with a string of unanswered calls from an unfamiliar area code. I let them ring out. I pictured the scene at the hotel as the family discovered there would be no room for them. I tried not to imagine the tears or the tantrums of disappointed children. My resolve was not about punishing the innocent, but about recalibrating a dynamic that had allowed exploitation to flourish. When Margaret called to say she had drafted the initial will, I felt as if something concrete had appeared out of the fog. She described the language she had used, careful and explicit. The will excluded Clara and Daniel from any distribution. It placed assets into charitable trusts with the trustees named and the mechanisms laid out. It required specific documentation before distributions could occur to any family members, thereby preventing anyone from using emotional pleas to gain access. She also suggested a public reading and the presence of a notary and witnesses at the signing. We scheduled the signing for the following week. In the days before, I practiced the speech I would make after it was executed. I wanted to be measured and dignified. I planned to explain my actions in terms of stewardship rather than revenge. I envisioned telling the story of Eleanor and how her values had guided me. I rehearsed my voice so that it sounded calm when I described the betrayal that had left me standing on a pier. On the morning of the signing, I dressed carefully. I wore the suit Eleanor used to say made me look like a man who mattered. My hands did not shake when I arrived at Margaret's office. The room smelled faintly of coffee and paper and the kind of order that signals competence. Margaret greeted me with a small smile that said everything was in hand. The lawyer, the notary, and 2 witnesses sat around the table. Cameras were set up at Margaret's suggestion to record the signing. The video would be a safeguard against claims that I had been unduly influenced. I read each page slowly aloud. I made no attempt to dramatize or to soften the language. The exclusion clauses were firm. The trusts were detailed. The contingencies were thorough. When the documents were signed and sealed, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The action was not about closing a door, I thought, but about opening a different one. I began to see my assets not as something to be funneled into entitlement, but as tools for better outcomes. I imagined scholarships for ambitious students, funding for local arts programs that nurtured creativity, support for elder care that honored dignity. It was a use of wealth that felt aligned with Eleanor's legacy. After the signing, Margaret asked me a final question. Did I want her to arrange a private meeting with Clara and Daniel to inform them of the changes I hesitated? I thought about the humiliating scene at the port that had started all of this, and I imagined the public spectacle of an attorney-delivered notice. I also thought about the children and whether a private conversation might spare them additional distress. In the end, I left that choice to Margaret. I wanted the truth to be known, but I also wanted to avoid unnecessary spectacle. Margaret agreed to deliver the documents in person at the airport upon their return. She explained that the shock would be a controlled one. She would hand over the will and explain the legal standing without drama. The meeting would be factual and final. In the days that followed, I returned to small routines that had been neglected. I walked in the park and watched the same elderly couples who had always been there. I read the newspaper and made notes on articles I wanted to share with friends. I took Eleanor's photograph down from the living room and spoke to it aloud, telling her how I had turned pain into purpose. The transformation in me was not immediate, but it was real. Yet even as peace settled, a strand of nervous anticipation threaded through my days. I knew that when the family returned, the reception would not be quiet. Their shock might turn to anger. They might choose the courts. They might attempt to paint me as senile or as temporarily unwell. They might threaten lawsuits and accusations. I had prepared for each scenario, but I also felt the human uncertainty that law could not erase. Margaret called late one evening to confirm flight details. She had arranged to meet them at the arrivals terminal 3 weeks after the cruise set sail. The timing would allow tempers to cool slightly, but it would also ensure that the family had time to discover the cancellation and experience the fallout. We agreed that the meeting would be at the international arrivals, a neutral public place where witnesses could be present. As I hung up the phone, I felt the old adrenaline that had pushed me through dense negotiations in my professional life. This was different now. This was personal and deliberate. I thought of the terminal where I had once stood abandoned, and of the faces of the people who had turned away from me. I thought of the children who had not asked for any of this. A single question kept returning to me as the date approached. How would they react when the truth hit them, not as a rumor but as a formal signed decree? Would they beg and plead? Would they rage and threaten? Or would they somehow manage to maintain the cool detachment they had shown when they left me on the pier? The answer would come soon enough. The arrivals hall would be full of curious travelers and weary families. Among them would be my family returning from a dream turned nightmare. Margaret would be there with the sealed documents. I would stand beside her and watch the moment their world shifted. And yet, even as I prepared for the confrontation, I knew that the most difficult challenge had nothing to do with law. It had to do with what I would do next if they chose to fight. Would I stick to a path of reason and measured response? Or would the old hunger for revenge take over and blur my judgment? The will was a tool for justice, but life would not stop there. On the day of their return, I would learn not only how they had planned to erase me, but how far they were willing to go to keep what they believed was rightfully theirs. The arrivals hall would become the stage for a reckoning that had been set in motion months earlier. The next chapter would not be about documents or lawyers. It would be about faces, reactions, and the human consequences of betrayal. The first call came late at night, a faint buzz on the nightstand beside my bed. I had silenced my phone hours earlier, but the screen glowed insistently, an unfamiliar international number flashing across it. I let it ring, then fall silent. A minute later it rang again, then again. By morning there were more than a dozen missed calls, all from the same number. I scrolled through them with a detached calm, sipping the coffee I had brewed in Eleanor's old percolator. The messages had grown increasingly frantic over the night, Clara's voice cracking with panic, Daniel's brittle with anger. Even Harold had called, his usually measured tone tinged with disbelief. "Father, it's Clara. Something has gone wrong. Call me back immediately. Victor, this is Daniel. I do not know what game you are playing, but it ends now." Another message, Clara again, her voice almost pleading. "They say the cabins were canceled. The children are exhausted. We have nowhere to go. Please just call us." I set the phone down and walked to the window, staring out at the garden Eleanor had planted years ago. The roses were in bloom, petals heavy with dew, their fragrance drifting faintly through the glass. Somewhere across the sea, my family was sitting in a crowded harbor, discovering that the fortress of entitlement they had built was crumbling. The vision should have brought me joy, but it was not joy that filled me. It was clarity. By noon, the number of missed calls had doubled. I ignored each one. I took a walk down to the cafe on the corner, where the owner greeted me with her usual warmth. I ordered tea and sat at a small table by the window, pretending to read the newspaper while my phone buzzed silently in my pocket. I wondered what scenes were unfolding thousands of miles away. I pictured the six of them stepping off the ship at their first port of call, tired but expectant, ready to be welcomed with luxury. Instead, they would have been met by a polite clerk, explaining that the reservation had been canceled, the suites released, the deposit forfeited. Their luggage stacked in the lobby, their children tugging at their sleeves, their voices rising in panic as reality set in. The thought was not pleasant, but it was necessary. They needed to see what it felt like to be erased. That evening, when I returned home, there were 30 more calls. I did not answer. I set the phone aside and prepared a simple dinner, scrambled eggs with toast eaten slowly at the kitchen table. The silence of the house felt almost luxurious. For years, my phone had been an instrument of obligation, buzzing with requests for money, for favors, for quick rescues from one financial crisis after another. Now it buzzed with desperation I had no intention of satisfying. By the third day, the tone of the messages had shifted. Clara's voice, once soft and pleading, now carried a note of accusation. "Father, how could you do this to us? The children do not understand. They are crying. They ask why their grandfather would ruin their holiday. Please do not make them suffer for your anger." Daniel's voice followed, sharp as a blade. "You are making a fool of yourself. Whatever satisfaction you think you are gaining from this will not last. When we return, you will answer for this. Do you hear me? You will regret this." I replayed that one, writing the words down carefully in my notebook. It was the second time he had used that phrase. You will regret this. By the fourth day, the children themselves were in the background of the messages, their cries piercing through Clara's attempts at composure. I heard Harold, too, his voice strained as he tried to calm the chaos. "Victor, it's Harold. I don't know what has happened, but please, we need to resolve this. We cannot keep drifting like this. Resolve this." The words stung in their familiarity. For years I had been the one to resolve their missteps. Tuition, unpaid mortgages, overdue holidays threatened by empty accounts. I had resolved everything quietly and without thanks. Now, for the first time, I was letting the consequences unfold without interference. By the end of the week, the messages had grown more desperate. They described sleeping in crowded hostels, waiting in endless lines, searching for rooms that were already claimed. Daniel admitted in one voicemail that their credit cards were nearly maxed. Clara confessed that they had put much of the trip on borrowed money, expecting me to cover the difference, as I always had. Each confession was like a piece of a puzzle falling into place. It was never about the cruise. It was about the certainty that I would pay, that I would continue to carry them no matter how heavily they leaned. On the eighth day came the breaking point. Clara's voice was raw, hoarse from sleepless nights. "Please, Father, the children are ill. We cannot keep moving like this. We beg you, please fix this. We know you can. We are sorry. We are so sorry." I listened in silence, the words echoing through the quiet of my study. Sorry. It was the first time I had heard that word from her lips in years. Yet even as she said it, I could hear the calculation behind it, the hope that apology might unlock my wallet once more. The next message shattered any illusion of reconciliation. It was Daniel again, his tone venomous. "Enough of this charade. When we return, you will see what happens when you play games with your own family. Old men like you forget their place. We will make sure you remember yours." I wrote the words down, each one precise. Old men like you forget their place. That night I slept with a strange calm. Their voices no longer hurt me. They revealed themselves, with each call peeling back the layers of civility to show the entitlement beneath. They wanted my money, not my presence. They wanted my silence, not my voice. When I awoke the next morning, sunlight spilling across Eleanor's chair, I felt stronger than I had in years. I brewed coffee, opened my notebook, and looked over the words I had written. Regret, resolve this. Old men forget their place. The evidence of their betrayal was no longer just in canceled bookings and missing tickets. It was in their own voices, recorded in desperation, condemning themselves with every threat. I knew what I had to do next. The phone buzzed again, another international call. I let it ring, smiling faintly. They could beg, they could threaten, they could curse my name across the sea. But the truth was simple. They had made their choice the moment they left me standing on that pier. Now it was time for me to make mine. I reached for the folder where Margaret had placed the draft of my new will. I ran my fingers across the seal, imagining the look on Clara's face when she finally realized that the safety net she had relied on had vanished. The calls would continue, the pleas would grow louder, the threats would sharpen, but the next time we faced each other would not be on foreign soil nor on the deck of a ship. It would be on my ground, with law and consequence standing behind me. And when that moment came, they would learn that betrayal has a price, and it is always paid in full. Yet even as I steeled myself, a sliver of unease crept into my thoughts. They had lost the luxury I had gifted them, but desperation can push people to reckless choices. What would they do when they returned, humiliated, empty-handed, and burdened with debt? Would they beg once more, or would they strike back harder, determined to reclaim what they believed was theirs? That question hung in the air like a storm cloud, waiting for the day of their arrival. The morning after Daniel's last venomous voicemail, I woke with the same clarity I used to feel on the mornings of my biggest projects as an architect. Back then I would stand in front of unfinished plans and see not what was missing, but what could be built. Now the blueprint before me was not of steel and glass, but of justice. My family's betrayal was the foundation, and every call, every threat, every tear-stained apology was another beam in the structure I was raising. I sat at my desk, Eleanor's photograph watching from the corner, and opened the folder of documents I had gathered. Transfers, receipts, invoices, the ledger of 2 decades of generosity. They had all treated me like a bottomless well of money, and now those papers would prove it. I slid them into an envelope and called Margaret. Her assistant answered first, brisk and efficient, and within minutes Margaret's voice came on the line. "Victor, I was expecting your call." I told her about the flood of messages from abroad, the threats, the admissions, the way Clara had confessed to putting the trip on borrowed credit because she trusted I would always make it right. I read Daniel's exact words from my notebook, each syllable steady. Old men like you forget their place. There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause that meant she was weighing each word. Then her voice came sharp and clear. That is not just ungratefulness. That is financial coercion. And you, Victor, are going to stop being their victim. We arranged to meet that afternoon in her office in the city. The building where Margaret worked stood like a fortress of glass and steel above the bay. I remembered walking through those same doors with Eleanor years ago when we had updated our wills together. The marble floors gleamed under the sunlight, and the air smelled faintly of polished wood and quiet authority. Margaret greeted me in the lobby herself, her hand firm, her eyes keen. She was in her early 50s with silver threads woven into her dark hair, and she carried herself with the composure of someone who had faced far uglier family disputes than mine. Come in, she said, leading me into a conference room lined with shelves of leather-bound law books. Show me what you've brought. I spread the papers across the polished table. Bank transfers, medical bills, tuition payments, mortgage bailouts, receipts for holidays, down payments on cars, even the cost of a private tutor for one of the children. Each one a piece of the puzzle, and when seen together they painted a picture of dependency that had been cultivated and exploited for years. Margaret examined them carefully, making notes in the margins, asking precise questions. This payment, she said, tapping one statement. What was it for Clara? And Daniel said they were behind on their mortgage. They promised to repay me in installments. Not a cent ever came back. She nodded, writing quickly. And this one, Harold needed surgery. His insurance would not cover all the costs. I paid the remainder. He thanked me once, but it was never spoken of again. For over an hour we went through the documents. By the end, Margaret had filled pages of notes. Then she leaned back in her chair and looked at me steadily. Victor, what you have here is a pattern. This is not generosity. This is exploitation. You have been carrying them financially for decades, and instead of gratitude, they responded with betrayal. I said nothing, but inside a cold truth settled. Hearing it from her lips made it real in a way that my private thoughts never could. Margaret continued, Here is what we will do. We will redraft your will entirely. We will exclude Clara and Daniel. We will also exclude Harold if you wish, given his complicity. Instead, we will redirect your estate to charitable causes. Education, arts, elder care, whatever speaks to you. And we will do it in such a way that no one can challenge it. Not in probate court. Not with emotional pleas. Not at all. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in. But I will ask you one final time. Are you certain, once you sign, this decision will be permanent? I thought of Clara's voice pleading through the phone. I thought of Daniel's threats. I thought of Eleanor's name written on a hotel booking used as a shield to erase me. I looked Margaret in the eye and said, yes, I am certain. The next week was a flurry of preparation. Margaret's office worked with precision, drafting page after page of language that stripped entitlement from the roots. The new will was long detailed, fortified against every possible challenge. I read each section carefully, asking questions, making small adjustments. I insisted that the language be clear. I was excluding them not out of cruelty, but because of demonstrated exploitation and betrayal. At the same time, Margaret arranged for safeguards. A physician confirmed my mental clarity in writing. 2 independent witnesses were summoned for the signing. A notary was scheduled. A video recording would capture the entire process, showing me reading each provision aloud, proving that my mind was sharp and my will deliberate. When the day came, I dressed in the same navy suit I had worn to Eleanor's funeral. The weight of it settled on my shoulders like armor. I walked into Margaret's office with my back straight and my hands steady. The conference room had been prepared with solemn precision. The documents lay on the table, thick and official. The witnesses sat quietly, pens ready. A camera stood on its tripod, its lens unblinking. Margaret cleared her throat and began to read the provisions aloud. The testator, Victor Harrington, being of sound mind and clear judgment, hereby excludes his daughter Clara Whitfield and his son-in-law Daniel Whitfield from any inheritance due to demonstrated financial exploitation and deliberate betrayal. The words filled the room like thunder. I listened, each syllable confirming what I had known in my heart since the day at the port. My hand did not tremble when I signed my name at the bottom of each page. My voice did not waver when the camera recorded me declaring my choice freely and without coercion. By the time the notary pressed her seal into the final page, it was done. The structure of entitlement that had bound me for decades was gone, replaced by walls of law and signatures. I felt lighter than I had in years. When the formalities were finished, Margaret leaned across the table. Now the question remains, when and how do we tell them? I considered her words carefully. I could have mailed the documents, let them discover the truth in silence. I could have waited until my death, leaving them to find out only when it was too late. But that did not feel right. They needed to see it, to face the consequences of their choices directly. Face to face, I said at last, when they return from their trip at the airport. Margaret nodded. Very well, I will arrange it. But understand, Victor, this will not be pleasant. There will be shouting. There may be tears. Are you ready for that? I thought of the moment. Clara had turned her eyes away from me on the pier. I thought of Daniel's grip tightening on her arm as they walked toward the ship, leaving me behind. And I said, I am more than ready. The days that followed were the calm before the storm. I spent them in quiet routine, walking in the park, reading in Eleanor's chair, tending to the garden. The phone still buzzed with messages from abroad, but I no longer bothered to check them. Their desperation no longer mattered. Their threats no longer frightened me. The law was on my side, and my decision had been made. Yet, as the day of their return approached, a current of anticipation ran beneath the calm. I rehearsed the confrontation in my mind, imagining the look on Clara's face, the anger in Daniel's voice, the confusion in the children's eyes. I did not know exactly how it would unfold, but I knew this much. I would no longer be the man they thought they could discard. When Margaret called to confirm the flight details, her voice was steady. They arrive on Thursday afternoon. We will meet them in the International Arrivals Terminal. I will bring the documents. You bring your resolve. I smiled faintly, gripping the receiver. I have plenty of that. The day arrived, warm and bright, the kind of afternoon when the city hummed with energy. I drove to the airport with Margaret beside me, the leather portfolio resting on her lap like a sword in its sheath. As the terminal rose into view, my heart beat faster, not with fear, but with anticipation. We walked into the arrivals hall together, the crowd buzzing around us. Families reunited with hugs, children ran into waiting arms. Weary travelers pulled their luggage across the polished floor. The loudspeakers announced incoming flights in a steady rhythm. Flight 446 from Athens has landed, Margaret murmured, checking her watch. They will be here soon. I took a deep breath and straightened my shoulders. This was the moment I had been building toward since the day I was left on that pier. The storm was about to break, and I was ready to face it head-on. I scanned the sliding doors marked "Nothing to Declare," waiting for the faces I knew so well to appear among the crowd. And as the first wave of passengers trickled through, I felt the weight of weeks of silence, betrayal, and resolve coiling like a spring inside me, ready to be released. What would happen in the next few minutes would decide everything. The arrivals hall breathed with a steady rhythm of footsteps, rolling luggage, and soft reunions. I stood beside Margaret near the "Nothing to Declare" doors, the leather folder in her hand resting like a sealed verdict. The screens above us cycled through flight numbers and cities. Athens, it read on time. A wave of travelers broke through the sliding doors, and my chest tightened, not with fear, but with a calm that felt newly earned. I saw them before they saw me. Harold came first, shoulders, rounded eyes down, pulling 2 heavy suitcases. Behind him were the children dragging small rolling bags, faces a mixture of fatigue and leftover excitement from beaches and bright markets. Daniel walked close to Clara, phone in hand, the look of a man already composing his next command. Clara scanned the crowd, hopeful at first, then wary, as if sensing a change in the air. It took only a second for the children to spot me. They ran forward with a sudden burst of energy. "Grandfather," one of them cried, but the word did not ring through the hall because it was swallowed by the noise. Their arms wrapped around my waist. I bent and held them, feeling a pang of tenderness that no betrayal could erase. I told them they had grown taller, that the sea had given them a glow, that I had missed them. They smiled with the pure relief of children who have found a familiar face in a confusing place. Then Clara stopped short. Her gaze slid from me to Margaret and fixed on the folder. Her smile vanished. I watched recognition move across her face like a tide. Daniel noticed the same thing, and his expression hardened. He slowed, and the current of people pressed around them. Harold lifted a hand in a brief, uncertain greeting, then let it fall. Margaret stepped forward with composed authority. She addressed Daniel by name, then Clara, then Harold, her voice clear despite the din. She said she represented me. She said she had documents to deliver. She asked that we step aside to a quieter place. The children looked from adult to adult, sensing the tension. We moved as a group toward a column farther from the stream of arrivals. Margaret stood between me and them, as still and steady as a stone. She opened the folder and held out an envelope. She explained that it contained my revised will and related instruments. She said the execution had been witnessed and notarized and recorded. She said it was in full force and effect. Daniel took the envelope with a jerk, as if seizing a contested ball. He tore it open and scanned the first pages with growing disbelief. His confidence slipped first, then anger flared. Clara leaned in, reading faster, her lips parting as she reached the exclusion clause. For a moment her face looked years younger, startled and uncomprehending, like a child who has touched a flame and cannot believe it burns. Harold did not try to read. He watched me instead, his brow creased with regret. The children tugged at Clara, asking what was happening. Clara told them to wait. Her voice trembled. Daniel kept reading, flipping pages with a sharp motion that drew a glance from a passing agent. Margaret explained in even tones that did not waver that the will excluded Clara and Daniel from any inheritance, due to documented financial exploitation and deliberate betrayal. She said that the estate had been redirected to charitable trusts with clear terms, and that the instruments were designed to withstand challenge. She added that she would be happy to speak with any attorney they retained. Clara asked how I could do this. She said the words slowly, as if careful pronunciation might build a bridge back to the past. She said the children were innocent. She said that families should not punish one another in public places. She said that I had always been kind, and that this was not me. Her eyes shone with tears that trembled but did not fall. I answered in the calm voice I had practiced in quiet rooms. I said that I had been kind, and that my kindness had been mistaken for weakness. I said that I had paid for mortgages and schools and doctors and vacations, and that I had been repaid with silence and manipulation. I said that the day at the port had made the truth impossible to ignore. I said that I would never again finance my own erasure. Daniel snapped that I had no right. He said that he would take this to court and win. He said that I had been influenced, that a cunning lawyer had poisoned me against my own blood. He said that the will of an old man could be bent and that judges would see through this. Margaret replied that every safeguard had been taken. She listed them without drama: a physician statement, a cognitive assessment, video testimony, independent witnesses. The record was complete. She told him he could proceed as he wished, and that the courts would be ready to hear claims supported by evidence rather than bluster. A murmur rose in the space around us. The airport has a way of making private scenes public, and strangers were beginning to slow as they passed, drawn by the gravity of a family in the middle of a quiet storm. Harold cleared his throat and addressed Daniel low and steady, asking him to stop. He said that this was not the place for threats. He said that consequences had come due. He said that we should all listen before more damage was done. Clara turned to me with a plea that trembled at the edges. She said that they had made mistakes. She said that the cruise had spiraled, that they had used credit, that they had been desperate. She said that she had been afraid to tell me the truth about the booking because she feared my disappointment. She said that she had wanted to give the children a perfect memory. She said that she did not anticipate the price. I felt the weight of her words and the echo of memories I wished were still intact. I thought of the day when she had been small and had asked for one more story before bed, a story where a father was a lighthouse. I thought of the way she had avoided my eyes at the port while the ship sounded its horn. I told her that fear does not excuse betrayal. I told her that a perfect memory built on deceit collapses into ash. I told her that the price was set the moment she chose to pretend I did not exist. The children pressed closer to her. One asked if they were in trouble. Another asked if I was angry forever. My heart pulled toward them with its old reflex. I knelt and told them that I loved them. I told them that adults sometimes make mistakes that take a long time to mend. I told them that love is not the same as approval, and that truth matters because it is the ground we walk on. Their faces softened, though they did not understand. Perhaps one day they would. Daniel tried a different tactic. He lowered his voice and said that we could resolve this if I would simply reconsider. He said that a private arrangement could be reached. He said that a signature could be withdrawn as easily as it was given. He said that the children should not be punished for an argument that had gone too far. He slipped the words like cards on a table, hoping one would turn the hand. Margaret answered before I could. She said that no further discussion would change the executed instruments. She said that any attempt to pressure me would constitute harassment. She gestured subtly at a nearby security officer who had begun to watch with professional interest. Daniel saw the gesture and bit back whatever he was about to say. Clara asked whether there was anything left for them. She did not look at Daniel as she spoke. She asked if the trusts included any provision for the children directly. She asked if all the past help counted for nothing now. Her voice thinned to a thread near the end, as if even breath was a negotiation she might lose. I answered that the past was not erased. The past was the record. I said that the trusts would fund music and books for children who had none, that they would place ladders where only walls had stood. I said that my love for my grandchildren would live in the opportunities created for many children, not in more money, poured into a pattern that destroyed character. I said that they would one day honor that choice, or they would not, and that either way it would be right. Harold finally spoke to Clara. He said that he had watched this happen for years, and that he had said nothing when he should have spoken. He said he was sorry for his silence. He said that pity and habit had been easier than truth. He said that the bill had now arrived. A silence opened between us. The crowd flowed around the edges of that silence like water around a rock. An announcement echoed overhead, distant and irrelevant. Daniel folded the papers back into the torn envelope with stiff, angry movements. Clara bowed her head and rested a hand on the shoulder of one child. Harold placed his palm on a suitcase handle and stared at the floor. Margaret closed the folder and said that the business of the day was concluded. She advised them to seek counsel if they wished. She reminded them that any attempt to contact me for the purpose of intimidation would be documented. She stepped back, and I knew our part of this scene was finished. I told the children to take care of one another. I told Harold to call me when he was ready to speak plainly. I told Clara that truth is a hinge and that doors close without it. I told Daniel nothing. He had spoken enough. We turned to leave. The hall felt brighter suddenly, as if the glass ceiling had shifted and admitted more. Sunday, my legs were steady, my breath was even. A weight I had dragged for years was no longer chained to me. Behind us I heard Daniel begin to speak again, low and urgent, the sound of a man who has not yet conceded that a world can change without his consent. Clara answered him in a voice I had not heard since she was a teenager, swift and fierce, as if a frightened animal had discovered its teeth. Harold said something in an even tone that broke mid-sentence. One child began to cry quietly. Another asked if we were going home now. Margaret and I walked toward the escalators that descended to the garage. The hum of the terminal rose and fell around us, ordinary and immense. For a few yards we said nothing. There was nothing that needed saying. The law had spoken in a clear voice. The heart had held its line. As we reached the top of the escalator, my phone vibrated in my pocket. For a moment, I considered ignoring it again. Then I looked down at the screen. It was an unknown local number, not the international code that had haunted my nights. Something in the timing pricked at me like a finger on the back of my neck. I answered. A careful voice on the other end asked to confirm my name. Then the caller said that a matter had been raised concerning a transfer I had made years ago, a transfer connected to a property I did not know I owned. The voice said that a complaint had just been filed. The voice used words like irregularity and investigation. The voice asked if I was available to come in tomorrow. I ended the call and exhaled slowly. Margaret watched my face and tilted her head in question. I told her what I had heard. She frowned not in fear but in calculation. She said that desperate people sometimes reach for desperate levers. She said that lies leave fingerprints. She said we would meet in the morning. We stepped onto the moving stairs, the terminal sliding upward behind us, and the garage opening below like a shadow. The confrontation was over. The war had shifted fronts. Somewhere behind me, a family tried to make sense of a future they could no longer command. Somewhere ahead, a new challenge waited, wearing the mask of official concern. I tightened my hand on the rail and felt the metal hum under my palm. The next move had been made, and it was not mine. I could not yet see the shape of it, only the outline. But I knew this much. The story was not finished. The storm that had broken in the terminal was not the last. And the name on the complaint when I saw it would not surprise me at all. The call lingered in my ears long after I ended it. An irregularity. An investigation. The voice had been polite. Careful. Too careful. I had heard that tone before in boardrooms, when men tried to mask a bluff with layers of formality. I told Margaret exactly what had been said. She listened without interruption, her eyes sharp behind her glasses. And when I finished, she gave a small nod. "It is a tactic," she said simply. "They are trying to frighten you. We will answer fear with clarity." The next morning we met in her office once again. She had already contacted colleagues in property law and financial compliance. Together they combed through the transfer records line by line, checking dates, amounts, and recipients. Nothing was irregular. Every transfer I had made had been lawful, every payment documented. The supposed property that had been mentioned in the call did not exist. It was a ghost conjured by desperation. Margaret leaned back in her chair after the review was complete. "This was Daniel," she said with certainty, "or someone acting on his request. They filed a false complaint hoping to use the hint of scandal as a weapon. They wanted you unsettled. But they forgot one thing. Paper tells the truth." She drafted a formal response that afternoon, citing every document we had reviewed, attaching certified statements from the banks, and demanding that the complaint be dismissed. She also filed a notice that any further false allegations would be treated as harassment and could lead to damages in court. She sent it with the same calm she always carried, and when it was gone, she looked at me across the polished table. "You are free, Victor. They cannot touch you. They cannot undo what has been signed. All that remains is whether you will tell them yourself or let silence be the answer." I thanked her, but the decision had already been made. Silence was no longer my ally. I had been silent too long. It was time to speak. 2 days later, Clara called me directly. It was not from an unfamiliar number, not from a blocked line, but from her own phone. For a long moment, I let it ring, then I answered. Her voice was fragile, stripped of the bravado I had heard in Greece, stripped of the rehearsed excuses at the terminal. She asked me why I had gone so far. She asked me if there was still a path back. She asked me if the children were doomed to carry the consequences of her mistakes. I listened. I let her speak until the words tumbled over themselves and finally stopped. Then I told her the truth. This was not about a trip, I said. It was about years of using me without respect. It was about the day you chose to look me in the eye and pretend I did not belong to my own family. I cannot erase that, but I can prevent it from happening again. That is what I have done. She wept quietly on the other end of the line. She said she was sorry again, and for the first time I thought I heard sincerity. But it was not enough. Sincerity cannot undo betrayal. It can only begin the long work of rebuilding, and that work had not yet started. I do not hate you, I said gently. I will always love you. But love is not the same as trust. You broke that, and it will take more than words to restore it. Do not call me for money again. Do not ask me to solve what you create. Call me when you want to speak as a daughter, not as a debtor. There was silence then, a small broken whisper. I understand. The line went dead. Weeks passed. Life returned to its familiar rhythm, but it was not the same life I had lived before. I walked through my house and felt a lightness in every room, as though a weight had been lifted from the walls. The garden bloomed brighter that summer, or perhaps I noticed it more. The chair where Eleanor had once sat felt less like a shrine and more like a place to rest. Margaret called one afternoon to say that the trusts had been formally registered. Letters from the chosen charities arrived, each one filled with gratitude, each one promising that the funds would be used for scholarships, instruments, meals, and care. I sat with those letters spread across my desk and felt a quiet pride. My money would no longer disappear into a bottomless pit of entitlement. It would build futures. It would create beauty. It would feed hope. One evening, as the sun slid down behind the hills, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea. The phone lay silent beside me. For once, its silence was not a wound, but a gift. I thought of the confrontation at the airport, of Clara's tearful voice, of Daniel's fury, of Harold's quiet admission of guilt. I thought of my grandchildren, and the way they had run into my arms with innocent joy. And I thought of Eleanor, her voice, steady in my memory. Do not let kindness be mistaken for weakness. I had not. Not this time. This story is not only about betrayal, it is about boundaries. It is about the moment when generosity becomes exploitation, and when love is tested by greed. It is about the courage to stand even in old age and say enough. Victor learned that family does not give us the right to use one another without respect. He learned that sometimes justice means walking away from those who believe they can walk over you. And he proved that betrayal may wound, but it also sharpens resolve. The moral of this story is clear. Kindness is powerful, but it must be guarded. Love is sacred, but it must be mutual. And when trust is broken, the most important gift you can give yourself is the strength to demand respect. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with others, and leave a comment with your thoughts. And do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next story. Your support means everything, and it helps us bring you more stories of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for yourself.